Grant, thank you very much, Janine. So yeah, as Janine's already outlined, my name's Simon Gray. I work for Ulster Wildlife as a Senior Technical Officer. I work on peatlands. So I'm going to run you through all things peatlands and peatland restoration then for the next few minutes. So I've already got a few things here that Janine's already covered, so I'll pass by those. Yeah, so what I'm basically going to do is run through what peat is, why it's important, where it is, and then what state it's in, and then what we're also doing in order to try and restore it and make sure it does what its core functions are. So start off with the easy question. Well, maybe not the easy question, but the initial question. So what is peat? It's talked about quite a lot these days because it's heavily linked to climate change. So peat is something that not a lot of people really cared about for quite a long time, unless you were thinking about heating your home with it. But now it's come very much into the fore because, as I say, of its implications on carbon emissions. So peat is a type of soil, and it's formed when organic material, mostly plants, when we say organic material, it basically just mean vegetation, plants, does not fully decompose. So usually if you have a pile of nettles and vegetation sitting or grass cuttings down the back of your garden or whatever, if you leave it there, it rots down and disappears. This is what happens whenever that stuff doesn't disappear. So it doesn't decompose because it's waterlogged, because there's no oxygen, there's no nutrients there, and the stuff that usually decomposes that material doesn't actually work. So it basically just builds up and builds up. And if you kind of think, this stuff here, the picture on the right-hand side, is called sphagnum moss, and this is a key building block of peat. If you imagine you have a layer of sphagnum moss which sits in like a wet pool, and it grows at its head and it dies at its feet, and over time then the bit that dies at its feet, that basically just builds up and builds up and builds up, and it grows at a rate of about 1 millimeter per year, and that means then that it takes about 1,000 years to form 1 meter. So pretty slow growing, but that's how it forms. So what we would have had a long time ago then in the UK and Ireland, we would have had a lot of these big pools that would have been, or lakes or lochs that would have been left over from the Ice Age. And gradually the water didn't have anywhere to go. The vegetation would have creeped in over the top of them, formed like a skin on the top, like a skin on custard. And over time then that's built up and built up until you get the formation of peat. And just to give you an idea of like how long some of this stuff has been forming then, Ice Age ended around 12,000 years ago, and some of the sites that we have measured peat cores on, they're somewhere in the region of about 9 to 11 meters deep. So they've been forming for that long. So that's kind of what peat is. If you imagine on having your head that building up in layers of organic material that doesn't decompose, and it's being locked away over time at that rate. So then where is peat? So peatlands, including blanket bogs, heathlands, raised bogs and fens, actually cover 12% of Northern Ireland's land. And actually peat soils that include any kind of peatland, actually cover about 18% of Northern Ireland's land surface. So out of the 4 UK nations, Northern Ireland actually has the second biggest proportion of peat soils next to Scotland. And then Ireland, as an island, actually has the third biggest proportion of peat soils for its landmass in the world. We're only beaten by the Finns and Canada. So it's pretty significant in this part of the world. Blanket bogs and heathlands, just to give you a few examples to kind of give you a bit of context and show you what they're like on the ground. They would be the sort of places that you would get in our uplands, so places like the Belfast Hills up in Divis, or the Antrim Hills up in Slievenora and Troston and sort of Glenarm. And then heathlands down in the Mournes be probably our most popular and well-known heathland areas. And then blanket bogs, we get very big areas of blanket bogs. You can see in that map there in the middle of the country and around the Sperrins, and then heading out west into West Tyrone and West Fermanagh. So we have quite a lot. And as you could probably see, judging from that map, there's a fairly distinctive distribution. So the further north and west you go, and then the higher in terms of altitude that you go, then peatlands become more predominant. So we have quite a lot less of it in the kind of the south and the east, but then the further north and west you go where it's wetter and we get more upland, then we get a lot more peatland. And then raised bogs are slightly different. I'll kind of outline what they are in a second. We get a lot of those in the Bann Valley, in and around the Lough Neagh, especially around that southern shore, and then in and around places like Omagh and Ferry Water. And then our fens are a slightly different type of peatland that we actually get in quite a lot in County Down then. So what are these different types of peatland then? So blanket bogs probably, well, not probably, are our most widespread type of peatland habitat. And they're called blanket bogs because they literally blanket the landscape. So you have to have a certain amount of rainfall, quite a lot, and a certain altitude where you get blanket bogs starting to form. And we have that in abundance in this part of the world again. So it literally, as I say, if you can imagine throwing a blanket across like a hilly landscape, it forms that right across those areas. So as I say, places like Culka Mountain down in Fermanagh or the Sperrins or the Antrim Hills. And then we get lowland raised bogs. So again, like I say, southern shores of Lough Neagh, this is a picture of Peatlands Park, if anybody knows it, near Dungannon. And these form kind of in our more lowland areas where you get, historically would have got those big water bodies that would have built up after the last ice age. And you usually have them connected with river systems. So our biggest ones are connected with places like the Bann, the Blackwater, the Ferry Water, the Struel, and all of their tributaries. So they're fairly common, and these would have been the places where people would have historically cut turf. So they have a very, very deep connection with a lot of communities and a lot of places across Ireland in general. And then fens are the final type then, and fens are a bit different, whereas raised bogs and blanket bogs, they have that, they're very, very acidic, and they build up peat soils over time because they're waterlogged and they get all their water from rain. Fens actually get their water from the ground. So it's usually where water is seeping through stuff like limestone, and it comes in underneath. And you get it in these depressions in the landscape. So places in and around like Lakeal, down Patrick and Strangford and those sorts of parts of the world, very, very common to get them there. And they're a bit richer. They're not quite the sort of stereotypical bog that you would imagine whenever you would think of one. But they're very wet, still very wet. So one of the things that I've mentioned there before is that peatlands have become very much in the spotlight over recent sort of years. And this is because of their impact on climate change and their ecosystem services. So ecosystem services is this term which is bandied about a lot these days, and it basically means what natural habitats do for us. What do they do for us for free that we would otherwise have to pay for in order to get done? So things like pollination is an ecosystem service that a lot of insects provide for us that we would otherwise have to do. We would have to pay people to do if they weren't doing it. So peatlands in that regard actually provide loads of ecosystem services, but only if they're healthy. So that's the key thing to remember. If they're in a bad condition, then peatlands don't provide these ecosystem services. So in Northern Ireland context, well actually like a UK and Ireland context, a lot of our drinking water catchments are from peatland areas. So I already mentioned there, a lot of our uplands are blanketed in peatland. And a lot of our drinking water catchment come from these uplands. So if you think of places like the Garran Plateau there in Antrim, where a lot of sort of Ballymena's drinking water would come from, or the most well-known one would be Silent Valley in the Mournes and Ben Crom, where a lot of Belfast drinking water comes from, they all come off peatland landscapes. And if the peatland is in a bad condition, you get a lot of peat particles, which is washed off into that water, and that actually has to be treated and cleaned, and that costs a lot of money because obviously nobody wants brown water coming out of their taps. And NI Water are now really engaging in peatland restoration because through projects like the one that they've done up on the Garran Plateau, they've realised that actually restoring peatlands saves them loads of money. So that's one example of ecosystem services that they provide. The peatland filters the water if it's in a good condition, and it filters out soil particles and it filters out impurities so that you get a much cleaner, fresher water before it actually gets to the treatment facilities. Most of our scenic areas, as I've already said, for hill walking, mountain biking, trail running, are all peatlands. So yeah, the Mournes being the most famous example of them, very, very popular walking destination. They support some of our most iconic species. So biodiversity is a critical element. That's obviously the main reason that we're really engaged in peatlands. So species like curlew and hen harrier and red grouse, they make their home on a lot of peatland sites. They also support huge numbers of farmers. So sort of low intensity grazing agriculture is the most widespread use of peatlands across Ireland and uplands in the UK. And they are by far and away our biggest natural carbon store. So that's at the minute why they're so much in the limelight. But just to give you an example of some of the species then that we get on some of our peatland sites, we have very commonly get our only reptile species on a lot of peatland sites. So a place like the Belfast Hills are a great place to see common lizards. You can see there in the top left. And they're our only reptile that we get natively to Ireland. Actually, we don't get any snakes, we don't get any other reptiles, but these guys do very, very well in these kind of habitats, eating insects and other bugs that are making their home on the bog. Then we get insectivorous plants, so plants that actually don't get their nutrients from soil like plants normally do. Because a lot of bogs are so poor in nutrients, these plants have actually evolved in order to get their nutrients from insects. So the top two images there, the one on the right is a sundew, and that is something that's very common on our bogs here. And those little globules are like little sticky bits of glue, and a fly will land on those and it'll get trapped. And then the little face of the flower actually folds inwards, and it kind of squashes the fly and then dissolves it using acidic juices and then sucks in the nutrients. So pretty sci-fi stuff. And the other plant there, the yellow flower, is called bladderwort, and it's actually one of the fastest moving organisms on the face of the earth. It actually traps like a little bladder of air under the surface of the water, and whenever a little underwater insect comes near to this bladder, then it uses like a whole system of vacuums and pressures to suck the little insect into this little capsule, where it then releases these digestive juices and dissolves it inside. So bogs are pretty terrifying places to be a fly. If you ever are reincarnated as one, be wary. But we get loads of really beautiful butterflies on the bog. So marsh fritillary, a really rare European species that we get, thankfully in quite good numbers on our bogs here in Ireland. And then green hairstreak, this bright green butterfly, which loves the edges of the bogs. Or dragonflies, like the four-spotted chaser there. Beautiful birds like golden plover, which we get out in the west. And bog asphodel there, that final flower on the right-hand side, the yellow one, is actually a bit of a strange one. It's colloquially known as bone breaker because it actually has this thing where if sheep eat too much of it, it causes their bones to become brittle. And we're not 100% sure whether or not this is actually just an old wives' tale, because these areas were so poor in nutrients that sheep just got brittle bones anyway. But it's still something that's widely believed by a lot of folks out in the countryside. So that's just a taste of the kind of biodiversity that we get in our peatland sites. So peatlands and climate change then. What is the link there? I've talked about the ecosystem services that they provide more generally. In terms of actually mitigating and their impact on climate change, what do they do? So I didn't touch there a second ago on the fact that when peatlands are in a healthy state, they sequester carbon. So that building up of layer on layer on layer of non-decomposing vegetation is effectively carbon which is not being released to the atmosphere. So if it's healthy, the bog is actively sucking carbon in. And all of that peat which is still stored there in those peat soils is locked away. As long as it's not degraded, it's not going anywhere, it's not being released to the atmosphere, so it's locked. So in the UK, deep peat stores at least 3,000 million tonnes of carbon, which is a lot. And then 10 million tonnes of CO2 are being lost per year from damaged peatlands in the UK. So in a bad state, whenever peat is exposed to the air, the carbon there reacts with the oxygen in the atmosphere and it creates CO2 which is lost. It also then gets degraded and eroded by rain and wind and everything, which brings it down into river systems, and it there further reacts with oxygen in the atmosphere and gets released as CO2. So the key thing to remember about peatlands is that when they're in a happy state, they're actively working for you and working against climate change. But when they're in a degraded state, unlike a woodland or something, they're actually actively working against you. So this is why the action to urgently address degraded peatlands at the minute is, well, it is so urgent. So between 3 and 30 tonnes of CO2 equivalent is released per hectare per year from a degraded peatland. And just to give you a bit of context, that is around 8 to 9% of all the UK's transport emissions per year. So all the cars on the road, all the shipping, all of the public transport, all of the transport of goods, materials, everything, nearly 10% of what comes from that, which is the largest emissions sector, is coming from peatlands. So it's not an insignificant source of carbon, and it's now being taken into the UK's sort of carbon budget, so they are really keen to try and address it. But healthy peatlands have the potential to sequester about 3 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. So the opportunity here is huge. Unfortunately, a lot of our peatlands are not in a good way. So this is an example of the summit of Mullacanini in the Sperrins, looking out towards the northwest. And this is a perfect example of what you don't want a peatland to look like. It's been heavily eroded. There's lots of bare peat, which is reacting with the atmosphere. It's also been washed away in heavy rainfall. This is what we don't want to see. And unfortunately, this is an all too common sight across the country. So there's some facts and figures. 86% of Northern Ireland's peatlands are in a degraded state. So pretty much most of them. Many are drained, eroded, burned, overgrazed, or covered in invasive species. So whenever you drain peatlands or they're eroded, then the water table drops. And once the water table drops too low, then they start to emit CO2. You need to have the water table within 10 to 15 centimetres of the surface for 90% of the year. If you go below that rate for too long, then your peatland is actively releasing carbon dioxide. And the same happens whenever you burn them or you overgraze them. Then you don't get the peat forming species that you need on the peatlands, and it's actively working against you. They need to be wet. That's the key thing to remember. But works are underway to try and restore peatlands across the country. So we have been a big part of that, but other organisations have also been a huge part of it, and there's a lot more to come. So we and many other organisations are blocking drains and repairing erosion to try and raise water tables and cover areas of bare peat across the country. And we've overseen the installation of thousands of dams across Northern Ireland now, carried out novel restoration of blanket bog, working with and training farmers in the process. So the vast majority of our land here is privately owned, and we know that we're going to have to get landowners and farmers on side in order to do this. And in fact, in many cases, they were the ones that installed a lot of the drainage channels in historically, but they weren't doing it because they wanted to do it. They thought it was the right thing to do. In most cases, they were following policy, and this was just flawed historical agricultural policy from years ago that now we're having to sort of reinstate. So just to give you a bit of an example, a bit of a taste of the kind of work then we do to try and restore them. So peat dams are the sort of core way of restoring degraded peatland. A lot of our bogs were drained in the past to either facilitate cutting turf or to make grazing more palatable, to allow grass to grow better. And what we do is we use extremely heavy diggers to go into these sites to block these drains using peat. And it seems nonsensical to use very heavy diggers, but actually we tend to use about 13-ton machines on really wide tracks. So these wide tracks act just like a snowshoe, and they spread the weight, and they actually end up having, even though they're really, really heavy, they actually only end up having about a PSI of about less than 3, which is actually less than a human footprint. So they actually end up having less damage than you or I would by walking across the bog repeatedly. But you can see there the water which is held up behind these peat dams once you start to install them. This picture was actually taken in 2020, even after we hadn't had rain for about 3 weeks. So you can see the impact that it can have. And this is just an aerial image of one of the sites that we worked on out in West Tyrone. And you can see the drainage features there, and then you can see the little digger at the top, which is, as I say, actually a 13-ton digger, installing these peat dams. And this is a great image we always just love to show people because it looks like stitching the bog back together. Looks like it's been cut, and then we're actively stitching those cuts back up. And and those dams will then hold up the water and raise the water table to where we need it to be. And then looking to the uplands then, whenever we have bare peat, like this area we had on Culta Mountain, then we have to use slightly stranger techniques in order to try and repair them. So these strange big woolly flumps that you can see in this image, these are things called coir logs, and coir is actually made from the byproducts of coconut husks, and they mold it into these big sausage-like nets, and they tend to come from places like India and Sri Lanka. We bring them over here, but they're the perfect thing for restoring degraded blanket bog because the fibrous material actually lets water through very, very slow, but it catches the peat sediment, stopping it from getting washed downstream. And this slows the flow of water down enough to allow plants that we want to be there to revegetate these areas of bare peat and begin forming peat again. So on Culta, we again trained the local landowners and brought up a bunch of volunteers to actively try and restore this very badly degraded area on the mountain. And this is us actually installing what's called a fish scale pattern on a very big wide area of eroded peat. And serious fun. Some of that ground you would sink up to nearly your elbows in. So you almost have to like build it as you are working on it and walk on them and then put the next one out. You kind of have, I always say to people, if you remember Wallace and Gromit in the wrong trousers whenever Gromit is building the railway track as he's going along on the train, that's kind of what we have to do here. And this is what it looked like before. So this is a big degraded area that we decided we were going to work on. And then this is what it looks like after. So you can see in the before image there, all the bare peat, all of the big peat hags, the big steep peat hags on the edges. And then this is after we've brought machinery in and reprofiled all those steep edges and then installed these coir logs. And you can see the amount of water which is being held up there now, which is going to allow that to come back into a healthy peat forming condition. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on then is what you can do. And one of the biggest reasons for peatland degradation in, well, actually Ireland and a lot of areas in Europe is extraction for compost. So because it's a very cheap water retentive kind of soil, then peat is used very, very regularly to build into bags of compost. Because it holds water very well, it's great for using in bedding plants and all sorts of other areas in the garden. But actually this means that you get scenes like in the top picture here, where you get huge areas of peatland that are very heavily drained, and then the peat is extracted using heavy machinery and taken off site where it's dried and then turned into pellets and mulch. And this has massive implications for carbon emissions, as well as things like flooding downstream, where the peat then doesn't retain the water in these areas and you get flash flooding incidences downstream. And we've seen a lot of this in the northwest in recent years actually. And a lot of that could actually be put down to degraded peatlands in the upper reaches of the catchments of those rivers. So the easy thing to do now, if you're into gardening or you're even remotely into buying compost at any stage in your life, is to use peat-free compost. And years ago, that used to be something that was very hard to do. You would struggle to actually get peat-free compost from garden centres or anywhere else, but now it's becoming a lot more common. So you should be able to get it a lot more readily in garden centres or even buy it in Tesco's and stuff these days. So if you're going to make one change that's going to have a massive positive impact, then please start buying peat-free compost. And then just wanted to touch on volunteering with Ulster Wildlife and the opportunities that there are. So it's great to be able to get teams together to come and spend a day outside helping on our nature reserves and on our sites that we're working on. And we work with loads of organisations, from yourselves to banks to other corporates, that bring out groups and teams for team building days. And it's an opportunity just basically to get absolutely stinking and do a bit of hard work and have a bit of crack, to be honest. And 99% of the time, everybody comes away having had a good day. And the work that you could do includes everything from removal of invasive species, paths and site maintenance, fence painting and repairs to fencing, litter lifts, meadow management, as well as even things like citizen science, so doing survey work of species, and even things like putting in plastic dams on peatlands could be something that we could do with volunteers. So it's a whole varied sort of remit, and usually it involves you getting out into really nice parts of the countryside as well. Caveat, it does rain a lot in this part of the world, so just be aware of that. And some of the sort of core or key details, so the timings are flexible, usually between Monday and Friday. We will have people that are going out on the sites that can take out groups. All the sites are risk assessed and we're covered by public liability insurance. All the staff are first aid trained and we have kits on site. And the work day includes a guided tour and talk of the site and an explanation of why we're doing the work. And it's an opportunity to learn new skills. And we do tool talks and give people training on the stuff that we're doing. So if anybody is interested, then please feel free to get in touch with both Sheila, who is our volunteer coordinator at Ulster Wildlife, and then Gwyneth with you guys to discuss opportunities for volunteering then with ourselves over, well, whenever you want, to be honest. And the benefits of volunteering, really, there are a whole host of different things, to be honest. You get to see a change in your local environment, which is always really good. Whenever, I was just saying before we started, that whenever you block a drain, it's amazing just to see the water building up behind it and then thinking about the positive impact that that's going to have. And that then sort of keys in directly with contributing to nature conservation in NI, so you know that you're having a positive impact on habitats and species there. And it allows you to better understand the work that we do, which hopefully would be of interest to a lot of you. But one of the key things is that it's really just good crack a lot of the time. It's good fun and people just enjoy getting out, and it's a bit of a break from your day-to-day, which a lot of people enjoy. And usually you end up laughing at a bunch of people for falling into drains and getting soaking wet. So at the expense of people falling into things, it's always good fun. And that is me. So if anybody has any questions, I see a couple of things in the chat there. Please feel free to throw them in and I can do my best to answer them. I don't know whether, Janine, then you want to say anything at this stage as well?
Sorry, I was on mute talking away.
Don't worry.
Just want to say thank you very much, Simon. If you want to start some of the questions, then hopefully if anyone else has any more, we can they can just either they can shout out or they can pop it in the chat, whatever works best. Some of them might be quite long-winded, I imagine, so it might be easier just to say them.
Yeah. Well, I can answer the ones that you've put in there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Don't worry. So how long would it take to bring all Northern Ireland's peatlands up to spec if you didn't face any barriers? So we actually have a bit of a handle on this at the minute because Northern Ireland is currently developing its peatland strategy. And terrifyingly, the area that we would really need to be bringing into good condition every year between now and 2050 in order to really sort of tackle peatlands and the emissions that are coming from peatlands is about 9,000 hectares a year, which is just monumental. So to give you a bit of an idea of how big that is, the Eastern Mournes designated ASSI, so talking kind of from about like Spelga Dam right across to Bloody Bridge, that's about 7,000 hectares. So 9,000 hectares a year is a lot. So we are really needing to scale up like massively in the near future. So once you dam the peat, how long does it take for peatland to recover? Really quickly. So once you've got that water table to that sort of Goldilocks zone, then you will stop emissions immediately. It might take a little bit of time before the vegetation sort of gets back to its equilibrium, but realistically, the emissions will stop immediately, and you would like to think, or we like to think, that the vegetation would get back to what it should be within a couple of years. So it's fairly quick. Really, it's just the water you need to get right, and then everything else does its own thing.
Are you getting any government support to try and approach this? Just because it is such a, as you say, such a vast scale, and obviously your resources are limited and finances are limited for these sort of things. So
yeah.
What's the workaround?
So yeah, we definitely are. There will need to be a lot more, but we are currently getting funding from NIEA, and we would have historically got quite a lot of funding from the EU. So that's a bit of a change that we're going to have to get used to, where we're going to have to move towards looking at more national funds rather than looking at European funds. Although we still do have an avenue to get European funds there because we're cross-border, obviously. Mm-hmm. So it is coming, but there needs to be a lot more. And we are looking and having conversations with the government at the minute to see exactly how we can scale up and what the framework and the system is going to be and how much money they need in order for us to actually tackle these kind of, to get these figures kind of done. So they are aware and they are working with us, but as with government, it's taken quite a long time, and we would just rather that they worked a bit quicker, but it is happening. It is happening. So we are getting support. Really what we actually need to do, the thing that's holding us back, is the capacity here. We need a lot more people like myself doing this kind of work. We need a lot more contractors that can do the work, and we need a lot more landowners that are willing to do the work. So those are the big things that we need to tackle over the next few years. And then the government funding will come because it needs to.
Thank you.
So Jennifer's just said there, can you expand a bit on how Peatland can support farmers? So the big change, one I would say, is that if you have peatland on your farm, then if you have a healthier bog which has water which is being held on it for longer, then that can actually positively impact the rest of your farm, because you may well get drains that are completely full in the wintertime, and that might then sort of enter into the spring, and you can't put stock out onto them for longer during the year. You have to house them for longer. But actually, if you have water which is being more water which is being held on the bog, maybe then that can have a positive impact on the rest of your farm, because the water isn't there then. But the big change that's going to come going forward is that landowners are hopefully going to get financially rewarded for having healthy peatland on their farm because of the carbon sequestration benefits. So we envisage that in time, if you have a healthy bit of bog, then based on the depth of that peat and the amount of it that you have and the condition that it's in, you will get a payment which will reflect the active carbon sequestration and the ecosystem services that that's providing. So that is coming, but again, it's just taking a bit of time. And Mark says there, advice for hill walkers and hikers to minimize impact on peatlands. The key thing is whenever you're in any of these kind of landscapes is that if possible, stay on the path. So historically, I worked on the Stairway to Heaven or the boardwalk on Kilka, and it was put in place because of the impact that walkers were having through erosion on the sensitive blanket bog, and then inadvertently then it just became 100 times more popular, and then the impact was just taken from lower down the mountain and then put onto the top of the mountain. And in those situations, the best thing that I can say is stick to paths as much as you possibly can, to try and avoid what we worry about all the time in those kind of situations is creep. So a path gets muddy and bogged up because lots of people have walked on it in wet conditions. Then the next people that come along don't want to walk in the middle of that, so they walk on the edge of the path, and then that eventually gets like that, and then so on and so forth. And before you know it, then you have a scar which is 30, 40 meters wide. So I think it's a very difficult thing. Unfortunately, we should probably stay away from certain places in terms of our impact on peatlands in terms of walking, but it's a very difficult balance to strike, because obviously we want people to actively enjoy and appreciate these sites, because you need to do that if you're going to understand them and you want to support them and keep them. But we need to try and find a way which people can do that without having an impact on them. So that's a very hard one, actually. Shannon's just said this, should we avoid using turf? Awkwardly, yes. Turf in Northern Ireland is definitely sort of disappearing. From our experience of working with a lot of communities and farmers, domestic cutting of turf or even commercial extraction of turf is becoming much less common. So it's nowhere near as big of an issue. The horticultural peat, which is extracted, is still much bigger in this part of the world. Down south, and particularly out west in the Republic of Ireland, turf extraction for burning is still much more common. We can't really get round the fact that it does damage peatland. What I would say is that small-scale domestic cutting with Joe Bloggs going out there and cutting his own bank with a slan and, you know, building up a small pile that he's going to use over the winter or something, it's got to the scale now where it's probably not having much of an impact. It's the machine commercial scale cutting which is causing the problem. And unfortunately, that's what people most often buy, and that does have a detrimental impact. But actually, whenever you buy, you know, turf briquettes from the garage or wherever, from the shop, a lot of that actually comes from Eastern Europe, Poland and Latvia and Lithuania. And it's having exactly the same negative impact there as we have here. So even though we maybe don't see it here on our doorsteps, it's still happening somewhere else. And so realistically, we should try and do our best to move away from using turf to burn. Apart from maybe in really small scale situations where it's more sort of about culture and heritage and tradition, but we can't go on degrading our peatlands for culture and heritage and tradition on the scale that we have been historically doing it. Hopefully that's not controversial. Yeah, does anybody else have any other questions? Are we happy enough?
I think that's everything. Thank you very much, Simon. That was really informative.
No worries.
I had no idea that 12% of Northern Ireland was actually covered in peatlands, which is quite interesting.
We have a lot, yeah.
I didn't even know we had local lizards either. So
there you are. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that actually.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting. It's good to know even the fact you said that the happy peatlands work for you and the degraded state works against you. It's something to consider. You know what, Par and I, we're helping to protect the peatlands, so it would be good if we could get some volunteers out to do a bit of work. You know, the Green Team went out to a bog, it was last year, just to see around and see the work we were doing and what was happening, and it was really interesting. So I think it would be a really good day out and a good team building experience.
Always appreciate any amount of hands is always appreciated, and yet you guys have come out in the past and helped us clear and scrub and invasive species on some of our sites in the past. So any more of that to come is as I say, much appreciated.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested, just contact Gwyneth and she'll get something organised for us. But thank you again, and hope you all enjoyed that. And if you want to say to anybody else, it'll be on the vote in the next couple of days. But that's great. Thank you very much.